Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad that you could join us for this program today. My name is Jocelyn. I'm from the Heinz History Center, and today we are going to be talking to a Freedom House Ambulance Paramedic. And this is going to be just growing on last week's session. But before we dive into that, I just want to go over a few things. So we are doing a webinar format. That means that you can see and hear us, but we cannot see and hear you. So we will be using the chat box and the Q&A box. You can find them at the bottom of your screen to be asking questions. So if you have anything that you want to ask John Moon as we are moving through this program, go ahead and put it in there. I have my colleague in the background, Allison. She'll be keeping an eye out on those features to make sure I'm getting your questions and are able to ask them. And also we do have closed captioning. There is a CC button again at the bottom of your screen that you should be able to press and have that auto caption available to you. With that, I'm going to do a quick little recap on what the Freedom House was, and then we're going to bring out our Freedom House paramedic. So last week we were talking about the Freedom House, and that is an ambulance service that began operating in 1968. It had two main missions, and that was to provide emergency medical care to select communities. So they primarily served the Hill District, as well as expanding into Oakland and downtown. And they also provided training and employment to people in those communities. They continued this mission throughout up until 1975 when they ended. And today we are joined by John Moon. He is a Freedom House paramedic that transitioned to work for the city of Pittsburgh as a paramedic in 1975. And he continued this work, I believe, until 2009. And he rose all the way up until assistant EMS chief when he retired. And I'm so glad that he could join us today. How are you doing today, John?
I'm doing fine, Jocelyn. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. And with that, we're going to hop right into that question session. So if you have anything on your mind that you want to ask, go ahead and put those in the chat or Q&A box, and then we'll hop right into this. Let me just rearrange my screen a little bit before. Okay. So let's hop right into this, John. When and how did you find out about the Freedom House?
Well, it's interesting because I was still in high school.
So you were on 18?
Yes, I actually graduated in 1968 from Fifth Avenue High School, and I would see their vehicles going up and down Fifth Avenue, ironically. And I really didn't pay too much attention to it. But once I graduated high school, I got a job working in a hospital, Montefiore Hospital to be exact, and I was an orderly there. And at that particular time, my primary responsibility was to take patients back and forth to the operating room, to the recovery room, and what have you. So I knew that there was something else I could be doing that would help people, but I didn't know what. And until then, I just happened to see two of the attendants from Freedom House come into one of the patients' rooms that I was caring for. And it was just the way they conducted themselves kind of just consumed my interest at that particular time. And they were so confident in their abilities and the way they conducted themselves so professionally. And I wanted to know, how could I become one of those individuals? And I thought that since I had worked in a hospital for 4 or 5 years, that I had all the experience that it took to work with them. And I didn't find that out until I went to apply for the position. And the director at that time asked me, could I diagram the heart or diagram the lungs? And I unfortunately looked at him and told him no, I couldn't. So he told me that I was not qualified to work there. So dejected, I went and left, and I said, there has to be some kind of way that I could find out how to get this job. And
So you weren't really sure of the scope of work that the Freedom House was really doing, like how intensive it was.
No, I didn't have a clue. The
You just knew
interesting,
you wanted to do it.
I just wanted to do it. And actually, I was in awe of the red lights and sirens that kind of boosted my motivation. I said, oh, I would just like to fly up and down the streets with red lights and sirens. And obviously there's more to it than that, but I went and found out how I could get the training at North Park Fire Academy. And once I did that, I went there for about 13 weeks, twice a week, and passed the necessary requirements and tests, and went back to Freedom House with my certificate in hand, and applied and was hired right there on the spot. And the interesting thing about that is I was still working at Montefiore at the time. So I worked 7 to 3 at Montefiore and 4 to 12 at Freedom House. I did that for 2 years, 16 hours a day. Of course, I was young and energetic at that particular time. And I got to the point where I got so interested in what I was doing at Freedom House that I resigned at Montefiore and worked full-time at Freedom House.
Yeah, that must have been really intense, especially with the type of training Freedom House required for their EMTs. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, it was quite intense. Initially, we spent a lot of time in the emergency room of various hospitals, a lot of time in the intensive care units, in addition to time in the operating room. We also spent time at McGee Hospital, actually in the labor and delivery suite, assisting with the delivery of infants. So it was a well-rounded training, and it was something that I just grew into the more training I got. It was just piquing my interest, and I just had to get more and more.
No, that's great. So you were working in hospitals side by side with medical professionals, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the interesting things about Freedom House is we actually take the emergency room from the hospital and take it directly to the person in need. So everything, with the exception of perhaps x-rays and putting on casts and things like that, that go on in a regular emergency room, we could actually do either in the back of that vehicle or in someone's home or a store or on the street or wherever we encountered a patient.
So how did people respond to you training in hospitals? Because you weren't becoming a doctor, but you were doing emergency care.
Well, one of the interesting things about that is doing a lot of our training, we had our very own medical director, who was Nancy Caroline. And she had an inside track to any intensive care unit and to any emergency room. Another mentor that we had was Dr. Peter Saffer, who was an anesthesiologist. He had control of every operating room in Presbyterian Hospital. So he was the chief anesthesiologist. So he could get us into the operating room to do training, while Caroline could get us into the emergency room and the intensive care units of the various hospitals. So that provided us with a well-rounded amount of training. And it was interesting that you asked that question, because it was not unusual for Nancy Caroline to be walking down the halls with 4 African-American paramedics, because we were it. walked right into an intensive care unit, right to a patient's bedside, and had us examine the patient. You had to listen for lung sounds or monitoring an IV or looking at the heart monitor. She took us everywhere we needed to go.
So were you just learning more about how to use the machinery, or were you also learning how to like administer drugs and whatnot? What other type of training like were you involved with?
Uh, it's a combination of those things. An example would be perhaps we would spend time in the coronary care unit of a particular hospital, monitoring heart rhythms and heart rates and training on that. So once we completed that phase of it, we already had a monitor on the vehicle, so we could actually perfect that training. No different than in an operating room while a patient's undergoing surgery, I would be sitting at their head, assisting them with breathing, because usually, whether people know it or not, they give you an anesthesia that actually stops you from breathing. And you're in the hands of the person that's sitting at your head at that time to assist you with breathing. So I got an opportunity to do that. And I think it's the best type of training in an actual pressure-packed live situation.
Yeah, because the ambulances that you were working out of when you were doing work on the streets were basically a small hospital room, right?
Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, the initial name for them were mobile intensive care units, primarily because they could provide so much high-level intensive care to patients away from the hospital itself. So they were given the name of mobile intensive care units. So on the side of Freedom House's ambulances, you would see Freedom House, and then you would see mobile intensive care unit written on the side of that, because that's essentially was exactly what we were.
That's amazing. So you're on the street doing this work, serving communities. How are people reacting to you arriving on the scene and busting out with full like medical grade equipment to help them?
Well, it was a learning experience for both us as well as the patient, because they were not used to being treated outside of the hospital. And oftentimes we would arrive on the scene and started treating patients, and the first thing they want to know is, why haven't you taken me to the hospital? So we had to essentially assure the patient that we've essentially brought the emergency room to them. And it took, some time to get that idea into the community's head. And after that, we were the only people they wanted to see.
That's great. So you're arriving on the scene, you're doing this wonderful medical care after having weeks and weeks of training, both in the hospital, in classrooms. But how are you getting there? How do you know that these people need help?
Well, that's a bit of a problem. In the Hill District, which was one of our primary operating areas, the police primarily handled medical transport from home to the emergency room. So oftentimes when a person had a medical problem, they would dial a 7-digit number, because there was no 911 at that time, and get a police dispatcher who would dispatch a paddy wagon to a person's home. The unfortunate thing about that is once they arrived, there was very minimal, if any, care provided to the patient. In their mind, the idea was to get you to the hospital as fast as they possibly can. And oftentimes, they would place you in the vehicle, and both police officers would in turn get up front, and you would be back there in the back by yourself. Now, heaven forbid something happened to you, i.e. you stop breathing or your heart stopped beating en route to the hospital. There was no one to help you. There was no care being provided for you back there. So Freedom House actually changed all of that. In addition to that, we were not getting the life-threatening calls from the police that we should have been getting. So what we had to resort to were monitoring police calls. So we would monitor the police calls on a scanner, and once a vehicle, a car, a wagon was dispatched to a life-threatening call, we would respond to that call, and oftentimes, more than not, beat the police to the scene of that call and actually get the patient, put them in the back of a vehicle, and obviously pass the police coming to the call while we're transporting the patient to the hospital. Now, there were times too where we got that at the same time, and that's where problems occurred, because you're dealing with the turf war, and there was really no accountability for the police at that time, so we obviously had to do what they said.
Yeah, so if you're in that situation where you're both kind of on the scene at the same time, do you kind of defer to what the patient wants? Like, and how did the patients usually choose? Did they have a preference?
Well, they had a preference, but they didn't know any difference. The only thought in their mind was that I need to get to the hospital. The police's idea was, I need to get you there as fast as I can, because that's what's going to determine whether you deteriorate or not. Freedom House's position is, I brought the emergency room to the person, so I've already eliminated the need to rush the person to the emergency room. The police couldn't conceive of that. It was their job. They've been doing it for years. All of a sudden, these guys showing up here in these white uniforms with this truck, and they want to take over our jobs from us. So you had that infighting. I remember going on a call with the police, and a person was injured in an accident. And I arrived there with my partner, and we could see the police actually pulling the person out of the car. The car was all crumpled up and everything. And naturally, we started saying, no, 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 you don't want to do that. After a few choice words from them, we had to like step back and allow them to go ahead and perform, their duties. But eventually, the word got around that our primary purpose was for the patient's good, as opposed to trying to take someone's job.
Okay, so there was a turning point where the city realized, like, oh, these people are here to help, and they're actually a totally different job.
Yeah, but yes, the problem was trying to sell the concept to the police, because they were the ones that we were in conflict with. If someone's, heaven forbid, shot, their primary concern is to preserve a homicide scene. So you have EMS arriving, trying to work on the patient, and perhaps destroying evidence, trying to save someone's life. So there's that conflict that's there that oftentimes you kind of bump heads with. But eventually we were able to get the idea over to them that we weren't the enemy.
So we're talking about this kind of shift in thinking in the city, and realizing that there is room for emergency medical services, and that there really are being put into place to serve a community. But why was it that, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but why was it that Freedom House wasn't supported by the city as well as they could have been? Because this is something that, if given the right funding, could have been sustained and cover the whole entire city, correct?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. And that was one of the efforts that we attempted during that time. What initially occurred is some of your affluent neighborhoods outside of the area that Freedom House was allowed to operate voice their concerns along the political lines, sort of something like, how dare you allow those people who perhaps are underserved and unemployed and in the ghetto have the best possible service, while I live over here in this mansion or what have you, and pay X number of dollars in taxes, and I vote for you and things like that. How dare you allow them to get better service than I can, and I have to utilize the police. So they voiced their concerns along the political lines and was able to get the mayor.
So we're moving into thinking that, well, not thinking, this happened. We're moving into the city starting to take back over this service.
Yes.
And last week I had a student ask about, did that happen abruptly? Like Freedom House operated for 7 years until 1975. What
Yes.
was that transition period like for you?
Well, the transition period was rather confusing because we had no idea that we were not going to be part of the system. The City of Pittsburgh EMS started its system probably May or June of 1975. We would see their vehicles going up and down the street. But oftentimes they were still orienting themselves to the geographical regions of the city. And I say that primarily because 98% of their service from the very beginning were white males from the suburbs. So they had no idea as to what they were coming into.
Yeah, they weren't really familiar with Pittsburgh. I mean, it's a really complicated city to navigate. So I could understand.
Yeah, you're right there. And one of the other things that was very troublesome is it was culture shock. You have individuals coming into the city that had very, very, if any, contact with African Americans.
Okay, so you're talking about this difference between the people working in these organizations. So the city of Pittsburgh tended to have more suburban members, primarily white males, versus the Freedom House being a mostly African American ran organization, ambulance service. What other differences were? Like I had someone ask last week saying, would you say that the Freedom House inspired the super ambulance plan? And I want to take that question a little bit further. Was the super ambulance plan in these individuals able to give the same quality care to Pittsburgh as Freedom House was able to do?
They were very successful from a promotional standpoint. And by that, I mean, if I can sell the concept to the citizens of the city of Pittsburgh, and once I sell the concept to you, then you can buy into what I'm selling. And what I encountered is that there were a lot of individuals that came into the city that had very little, they had the training, but very little experience in dealing with critically ill patients. Not all of them, but a great number of them. So you add that with the culture shock that the individuals experienced when they came in, because let's not forget, I have a preconceived notion in my mind as to what it's like coming into the inner city, because I've heard all of these bad things and terrible things that go on into. So in my mind, I'm coming into a war zone. And since I'm coming into a war zone, I have to prepare myself both mentally and physically to enter into this war zone.
I think that feeds really perfectly into this other question that I'm going to ask is, were Black communities given the same medical attention following the end of Freedom House by the city of Pittsburgh? And I think it's just expanding to, were the communities in Pittsburgh that were being served previously by Freedom House still getting that level of care when switched over to city coverage?
That's a very, very good question. And I can only answer that by my own personal experience, primarily because working at Freedom House, you called us, we came and transported you to the hospital. The city of Pittsburgh instituted a system and they named it no medical emergency, which simply said that the paramedic could come to your home, talk to you, ask you a series of questions, and then determine whether you were ill or sick enough to ride in his vehicle. And by that, I could tell you that, you know, you're not what we call a medical emergency. Why don't you seek other means, i.e. a jitney or cab or a friend or family member or whatever to get you to the emergency room. And that was a policy that was part of the city of Pittsburgh's system. And that was one that I had to get used to seeing, because here I am in a benevolent type of environment that all of a sudden now I'm going into someone's home and the person that's in charge of the crew says, okay, well, you're no medical emergency. We don't have to transport you to the hospital. And they would leave.
Yeah, just from the stories that you told me previously of like, that's such a contrasting way to care for patients and communities when the Freedom House would transport non-medical emergencies as well as provide emergency services, to coming into a situation where if you weren't on your deathbed or about to die, like we couldn't take you anywhere. So I can see that contrast and can only imagine the struggle you would face when that's right in front of you. But I think we skipped over a really important part in your story, and that's talking about this transition to working for the city. So Freedom House closes down 1975. You're left with the choice of working for the city or leaving emergency services.
Yes, yes. I chose to stay on with Freedom House to the very end. There were a couple of individuals that left and went to the city when they first began, but I chose to ride it out to the very end. And when I went to the City of Pittsburgh EMS, I took all of this training, all of this knowledge. I've been trained by the best in critical care medicine. We wrote the book on how paramedics are to treat patients. And I arrived at the City of Pittsburgh and I was essentially a second-class citizen, for lack of a better term. Wasn't allowed to treat patients. Instead of me being part of a crew, I was labeled as one of those people that came over from Freedom House. So that was a great distinction there. It was very easy to know where we came from because the city really didn't have any African Americans working for it at all until we came over. So you deal with that transition and then not being allowed to do anything, particularly the stuff that you enjoyed or loved doing, kind of put you in a position as to whether I want to deal with this junk or do I want to just go someplace else.
When did you know that you were going to stick it out, that you were going to stay?
Well, I found out the hard way when I went on a call with the crews that I was working with, and we had a life-threatening situation, and the crews didn't know what to do. Patient unconscious, not breathing, and didn't have a heartbeat, and they didn't have a clue as to what to do. And they looked at me and says, "Okay, you take over." Now, the common thing would be, well, look,
There's nothing I can do.
I'm not allowed, which I wasn't. I'm not allowed to do anything. But I put the patient first and then turned around and started assigning different duties and responsibilities for them to do to help the patient. And from that point on, I had made up my mind that I was able to kind of figure out the overall plan was to try to prove to me that I couldn't do the job. The unfortunate thing about that is it worked with the majority of the people that came over from Freedom House. I would say 85% of them, if not even higher, were kind of weeded out.
So you made a decision that you were going to stay, but in that moment, you made a decision that you were going to continue to give quality care to the best of your ability. Was that also the moment that your team realized your value?
Yes. Word got around that I knew what I was doing. And
Just save someone's life. You just know what you're doing.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I was still challenged on some of the decisions that I was making until they were proven to be correct. And from that point on, I was considered part of a two-person crew because I had, according to them, proven myself to be worthy of working with the City of Pittsburgh EMS system.
And slowly but surely, you moved up through the ranks and made it to the very top. Along the way, did you keep in mind the mission of Freedom House or the lessons you learned at Freedom House? And how did you kind of implement them into everyday work?
Well, that's an interesting concept because one of the things that I found out, and not necessarily being critical of the service itself, there were people telling me what to do and when to do it and how to do it, that I knew more than them. So that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, but at that particular time, there was very little I could do about it. So I continued to prove myself, and to the point that the promotional opportunities started presenting themselves, and I took advantage of them. And I rose up through the ranks from being in charge of a crew to being a field supervisor to being in charge of the supervisors to running the day-to-day operations of a department. And I maintained that until I retired from Pittsburgh EMS. However, during that time, I noticed that there was a lack of diversity and inclusion in the department. So I knew how this whole foundation had evolved. So once I said there has to be something wrong with this picture, because no one was complaining about it. Every class that came in, every hire that came in, were nobody that looked like John Moon. So I made myself a promise that if I ever got into a position to impact that I would do that. And once I became chief supervisor, I initiated the diversity recruitment program for the City of Pittsburgh EMS, where we went out into the community in conjunction with the personnel department to actually recruit African Americans that had no idea of what it was like to be in EMS. And we were able to successfully bring them on, hire them, pay them a salary when they were going through EMT class. When they got the paramedic training, gave them a boost in salary. I was able to get my department to hold vacancies open that by the time they finished their training, they could just slot right in to jobs they were waiting for.
So you're really talking about diversifying and making sure that the community that you're serving is being reflected in the people that are doing the work. And I think that's a really great thing. And I think this is a perfect place to pause and see if there's any questions in the Q&A or chat box, Allison, that I might be missing.
Nothing as of right now. Just wanted to ask a question from our presentation last week, which I thought was a really interesting one, where during Jocelyn's presentation about the Freedom House, there was a question, or there was a mention of the sirens not being able to be used in downtown Pittsburgh. Do you want to talk a little bit about why those sirens weren't being used and why the city apparently didn't want the Freedom House to be successful? I know you've already touched on that a little bit, but specifically the siren thing.
Well, one of the problems that Freedom House couldn't compete in was a political environment. And being that we were not set up to compete in a political environment, politics started to rear its ugly head. And that was one of the political barriers, for lack of a better term, that were thrown in our direction as far as the service is concerned. The city could say that primarily because they were funding Freedom House's efforts to operate out of downtown Pittsburgh. So they could say, I don't want you using sirens when you come into downtown because I'm paying for that portion of the service. The stupidity of it at that time wasn't recognized at all, but it was just something to just throw a dart to make life
Yeah, I can see how that would hinder anyone's ability to give, like, yes, you're delivering on the scene medical care, but there are things that you might not have in the ambulance that you have to go to a hospital to have access to. And that time frame between incident of injury and getting to the hospital and having the full facilities is something that was really important, correct?
You're absolutely correct. Response times is a top priority in all EMS systems. And it was in ours. The unfortunate thing about that is that we were being noticed more so than anything because of the sirens, because ambulance with sirens attracts people. And two people going through the middle of downtown at rush hour and both people sitting in the vehicle that look exactly like me, there's something wrong with that picture. And I'm being truthful. So I can't publicly acknowledge that. So I come up with other little nuances or ways to be problematic to you that you perhaps won't realize. And the unfortunate thing about it is that was just one of the many different things that was occurring during that time frame. So that was slowly leading to that transition period that we were talking about earlier, is let's stop them from using the sirens. The response times will be up. Nobody will call them. And
yeah, it seemed like they were just trying to like slowly chip away at the Freedom House and force them to decrease on their effectiveness.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're absolutely correct. And it's one of the probably sad success stories of Freedom House. There are many, but that was one of them. And like I said, it was extremely difficult to compete in the political environment at that time, back in the 60s.
I think that's amazing that was happening at the same time that really the nation's like medical community eyes were on the Freedom House. Like people were turning you to try to figure out how they can move forward and provide that kind of service.
And you're absolutely right, because Freedom House was successful at securing a federal grant to write the book on how to train paramedics nationwide. And here in its own hometown, it was run up against these barriers and hurdles and different trials that we had to overcome. And the one thing that comes to mind when you put that picture up, oftentimes people look at the picture and they see people. When I look at that picture, words like,
let me see if I can share my screen and see if I can show the picture that you're talking about. Let's see. That one?
yes, that one there. When I see that picture, words come to mind like perseverance and determination and in spite of and despite, and because these are the individuals that persevered, that were determined to make a system now that's glorified on television and throughout this country. These are the individuals that are responsible for it. And that's what I see when I look at these people, despite the fact that I'm standing there in the middle, those words come to my mind, and I said, wow, if only people knew how determined, how these people persevered, how society looked at them as unemployables, or society's throwaways, or least likely to succeed. These are the people that did it. And that's why it's very difficult for me to conceive the idea that nobody knows about Freedom House.
I think that is the perfect, such a succinct way to wrap up this story of the Freedom House. Is like all those adjectives can describe this group of people and this whole organization, and it's such an unknown story. And with that, we're right up against our time. So I just want to check the chat and Q&A and make sure I didn't miss any questions. Allison, can you just confirm that for me?
Nothing as of right now.
All right, great. I got them all. But I really want to thank you, John, for joining us today and just being a wealth of knowledge. Your stories are amazing. And I think they really add such a diverse and different view of this historic event. This is history at its finest. And I really want to thank you for that.
Well, I thank you for allowing me to share it, because even though John Moon is sitting before you talking about it, it's done because I want those individuals in that picture you just put up recognized. And that's what my primary goal is. I'm their voice. The unfortunate thing is some of them are no longer with us and able to do that. So I'm the voice out there that's sharing this story. And the commitment I've made myself is I will continue to do it until I'm no longer able to do it. So I really want to thank you and the Heinz Center and Allison and everyone else involved for giving me this opportunity. It was a pleasure.
Again, thank you so much. And thank you all of you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this 2-part series, and I hope you had a great time and have a good day.
Thank you.